The late-night gala had finally dissolved, allowing Asher Vance to retreat to the quiet of the East Wing dorms. He shrugged out of the formal jacket that smelled of expensive whiskey and old wood paneling, changing into a simple gray sweatshirt and worn jeans. He felt for the leather portfolio holding his calligraphy supplies and made his way to the attached study, where he lit a single desk lamp. He intended to continue his transcription of the ancient philosophical texts. But the liquor he'd consumed was potent, and the old study, with its drafty single-pane window, offered no defense against the creeping autumn chill. The meticulous work of copying the dense script was draining, and within 15 minutes, the alcohol's warmth bloomed in his head. Asher found the silver fountain pen in his hand impossibly heavy, the cold and the drowsiness a suffocating combination. Pinching the bridge of his nose did nothing. Soon, his head slumped forward, and he fell into a deep, oblivious sleep on the desk. An unknown amount of time passed. A soft rapping came at the study door. A voice, quiet and hesitant, asked if its owner could come in, addressing Asher as a senior. The drink, combined with the exhaustion from 2 grueling duels earlier that day, had pulled Asher into a profound slumber. He offered no response. After a moment, the person outside spoke again, apologizing for the intrusion. Caleb Thorne entered, carrying a small electric space heater. He nudged the door shut with his foot, his gaze sweeping the small, cluttered room before settling on Asher's sleeping form. Seeing him like that, Caleb didn't pause to deliberate. He set the heater down, its coils beginning to glow with a soft orange light. He glanced at the folio, where Asher had only managed to copy the opening paragraph. Caleb carefully slid the page out, folded it, and tucked it inside his own coat. The study contained a narrow daybed for naps, and Caleb knelt beside it, brushing away some stray books and papers. He found a thick wool blanket folded at its foot and spread it out before returning to the desk. He murmured another apology to the unconscious Asher. Then, with one hand supporting the back of Asher's neck and the other under his knees, Caleb lifted him into his arms. Asher, cold even in his sleep, instinctively burrowed closer to the sudden warmth. He pressed his forehead against Caleb's chest, a deep sense of comfort washing over him in his dream. Through the layers of cloth, Caleb could feel the profound chill radiating from Asher's skin. Thinking of the day's taxing events that had led to this state, he found himself whispering, asking if Asher was cold. Asher, still asleep, shook his head slightly and mumbled that he was fine. He said he wasn't cold, but his hands and feet were like ice. Caleb gently placed him on the daybed. As he reached for the blanket to cover him, Asher shifted. The loose hem of his sweatshirt rode up slightly, exposing a pale strip of skin at the small of his back. It was an inconsequential detail, yet Caleb felt a flush of heat rise to the tips of his ears and quickly looked away. He wanted to pull the shirt back down. But the moment his hand touched the fabric, Asher's own hand shot out and clamped down on his wrist. Asher's words were a slurred, indistinct murmur about his back aching. Having been by Asher's side for years, Caleb knew about the array of old injuries he carried. His back was certainly no exception. After 2 fights and a long evening of sitting and drinking, it was no surprise it was acting up. Yet as Caleb's gaze drifted back to that sliver of exposed skin, his thoughts veered from their proper course. His throat tightened. The calm on his face slowly gave way to a turbulent, submerged current of emotion. After a long moment, he knelt, pulling Asher into a fierce embrace, a scorching heat filling his chest. The tantalizing glimpse of white had made him forget himself, and he began to whisper Asher's name over and over. The pressure on his back tweaked the old injury, and a low groan escaped Asher's lips. The sound nearly drove Caleb to madness, his arms tightening their hold, as if he were clinging to a rope before leaping from a cliff. Caught between reckless abandon and a single, fraying thread of reason. Soon, he leaned in and, with no experience to guide him, bit down on Asher's lips, which still carried the faint scent of whiskey. Asher hissed in his sleep. The sharp pain registered, but exhaustion kept his eyes sealed shut. He could only act on instinct, pushing weakly at the other person's shoulder. He muttered for Leo to stop fooling around, that he was tired. The name was like a bucket of ice water. Caleb snapped back to himself, scrambling away from the bed in a disheveled panic. He stood there for a moment, touching his own lips, the taste of liquor still lingering. Then, in a flurry of movement, he pulled the blanket over Asher, waved a hand to extinguish the desk lamp, and fled the study. He had barely stepped into the main dorm corridor, his heart still hammering against his ribs, when a cool, mocking voice drifted from the side. The voice wondered aloud where Caleb had been. Caleb, still agitated, whipped his head around, startling Leo Sterling, who took a step back. Recovering, Leo's lips curved into a smirk. He asked what was wrong with Caleb, observing how flushed his face was, and sarcastically questioned if he had gotten drunk. At the mention of drink, Caleb felt the scent of whiskey flood his senses again, his pulse thundering in his ears. He was in no state to trade barbs with Leo. He shot him a cold look, turned sharply, and walked away without a word. The moment Caleb was gone, Leo pushed open the study door. Asher was sleeping soundly, completely unaware as Leo turned him over, his gaze dropping to Asher's slightly swollen lips. Leo's expression turned chillingly cold. The scent of the other man was everywhere. In the study, on Asher's clothes and staining his mouth. Leo leaned close to Asher's ear, his eyes, so different from their usual playful state, now deep and unnerving. He whispered a question, asking why Asher would let someone else touch him. He informed the sleeping figure that he was displeased and that there would be a punishment. Not long after, a sweet, botanical fragrance began to fill the small room. When Asher first inhaled it, his brow furrowed slightly in his sleep, as if sensing the aroma's malevolent intent. But the scent was pervasive, and he inevitably drew it deeper into his lungs. Leo didn't get on the bed. He let the fragrance envelop Asher completely, then picked up a new, blank folio and began to transcribe the text by the pale moonlight filtering through the window. About 30 minutes later, Asher felt as if he were adrift in a confusing sea, floating in a vast, white space. He tossed and turned on the daybed, his breathing shallow and rapid, his neck arched back. Each gasp was filled with a mixture of extreme, repressed pain and an unspeakable pleasure. At first, Leo had been pleased with himself, humming a tune as he expertly mimicked Asher's handwriting. But as time wore on, he began to understand he had trapped himself. He grew restless, an uncomfortable heat building within him. His transcription became erratic, his lips pressed into a thin, white line of restraint. After finally forcing himself to finish the page, Leo rushed to the bed, throwing back the blanket and sliding in beside Asher. Asher was lost in some unknown dream, moaning softly, his clothes damp with sweat. But his body was finally warm, some parts almost feverishly hot. Leo peeked his head out from under the blanket, wrapping his arms around Asher's waist. Shadowy, vine-like tendrils crept up from the floorboards, twining around his and Asher's ankles, binding them together. A few thinner tendrils slithered up under the loose cuff of Asher's jeans. Moments later, Asher's breathing hitched, becoming sharp and heavy as he pleaded for it to stop. Leo rested his head on Asher's shoulder, his eyes half closed, a satisfied smile on his lips. He murmured to himself that Asher was so wicked, tempting him like this. When Asher woke the next morning, he was drenched in sweat, his mind a whirlwind of fragmented, sensual images. He nearly rolled right off the narrow daybed. The previous night had been a series of bizarre dreams. In the first, he dreamt he was tied to a chair, blindfolded. His legs were suspended by some unknown soft material, pulled apart, leaving him unable to struggle. A soft, multi-limbed creature moved over him endlessly, teasing him to the point of wanting to scream curses. Yet he was helpless to stop it. his strength gradually fading until he could only let it have its way. He felt like a book being read from cover to cover. Every place the creature's touch landed a form of seduction. The second dream was even more surreal. He was at the edge of a large, dark swimming pool, bathing. Halfway through, the entire body of clear water transformed into the creature from the first dream and swallowed him whole. In the suffocating darkness, his right foot cramped violently 3 times. Still ached faintly now. Coming to his senses, Asher noticed a lump in the blankets beside him. He reached over and pulled the blanket back. A pair of bare arms immediately pulled it shut again, followed by a soft, complaining noise, as if scolding Asher for disturbing their sleep. Asher knew then who it was and couldn't help but chuckle. He patted the mound in the blanket that concealed a head of messy hair, then straightened his own clothes. Getting up, he walked to the desk and saw a completed page of transcription lying there. The ink was dry, the handwriting a perfect imitation of his own. He picked up the folio, a smile just starting to form on his lips when he heard a noise at the door. Asher looked up to see Caleb standing in the doorway. He seemed to have something to say, but before he could speak, Asher raised a finger to his lips, signaling him to be quiet so as not to wake Leo. He slipped on a jacket, slid his feet into his shoes, and stepped out into the hall, pulling the door almost closed behind him. Only then did he ask Caleb what he needed. He was still holding the folio that Leo had completed. Caleb was dressed in a heavy coat against the morning chill, his expression severe. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes fixed on the folio in Asher's hand. His voice sounded slightly off when he asked if Asher had managed to finish the transcription last night. Asher waved his hand dismissively, explaining that he hadn't done it. He had been too drunk and had passed out early, which had ended up burdening Leo. He recounted how Leo had helped him to bed, taken care of him, and even finished the work for him. He mentioned that Leo was still sleeping soundly and they should speak quietly. He then asked Caleb what important matter brought him here so early. Caleb kept his hands behind his back, his features as cool and remote as ever. He informed Asher that he had a duel that day against a student from the Clearwater Annex. He wanted to ask Asher for some pointers on his technique. Asher agreed readily and reached out to ruffle Caleb's hair. He told him to wait at the training grounds. He would be there after he washed up and changed. Caleb nodded, watching as Asher went back into the study. Only then did he pull from behind his back the folio page he had taken the night before, the one with Asher's opening paragraph. He had stayed up all night to complete the transcription himself. Now, however, there seemed to be no point in giving it to him. Caleb tucked the folio back into his coat and turned to leave. Asher re-entered the room, carefully closing the door behind him. He had barely turned around when a sudden voice from behind made him jump. It asked who he had been talking to. Asher was startled, but when he turned, he saw Leo standing barefoot on the cold floor, staring at him intently. His surprise turned to a frown. He walked over, hoisted the reckless boy up, and unceremoniously dropped him back onto the bed. He scolded him for walking around without socks, asking who would have to take care of him if he got sick. Leo, however, was persistent, asking again who Asher had been talking to. Asher replied that it was Caleb, who had asked for help with his dueling. Leo hugged the blanket tighter, his tone petulant as he declared that he wanted pointers too. Asher almost laughed aloud. He agreed that Leo certainly did need some pointers, otherwise he'd get knocked out of the ring in 2 moves like last time, which was so embarrassing. Leo protested that Asher was making fun of him. Asher quickly backtracked, patting Leo's short, buzz-cut hair and cooing that he was just worried about him. Leo, pathetically, blushed at the affectionate gesture. He hummed contentedly, his bad mood vanishing. Having placated the ruffled cat, Asher planned to go change his clothes, particularly his boxers. But as he turned to leave, Leo grabbed him from behind, making another bold demand. He wanted a kiss. Asher made a sound of exasperation, asking what was wrong with him and how old he was, pointing out that he was almost taller than Asher now. Leo didn't say a word, just tilted his head up and looked at him with a pitiful expression. The kitten-like gaze and the faint dark circles under his eyes instantly softened Asher's resolve. After all, the kid had looked after him all night and even did his transcription for him. What was the harm in indulging him a little? With that thought, Asher leaned down and kissed him on the forehead. Leo whined that it wasn't sweet enough. Asher's face reddened slightly. He gave Leo's head a light shove. He told him to stop messing around and get dressed, chiding him for always sleeping naked and risking a cold. Leo blinked, retorting that it was warmer to hold Asher that way, and asked if Asher didn't like it. Asher fled the room. At the moment, any word related to holding or hugging made his legs feel weak, especially with the half-joking, half-serious expression on Leo's face, which sent a strange flutter through his chest. But the Blackwood Gauntlet was the most important event of the semester. No matter how distracted Asher felt, the moment he stepped onto the dueling platform, his mind became clear and focused. His opponent in this round was Sienna, an old rival. There was little tension between them. The atmosphere was as relaxed as a coffee meeting. Sienna greeted him, remarking that he looked well today. Asher had noticed the same thing when he looked in the mirror that morning. Thinking back on the strange, sensual dreams from the night before, he found it quite remarkable. He wondered if this was the fabled yin-yang energy exchange, though he felt more like the one who had been drained. Sienna drew a pair of short, weighted batons from her belt, twirling them expertly. She asked if Asher planned to face her using only his fountain pen again today. Asher snapped his focus back to the present. He told her to guess. Sienna laughed, admitting that she'd secretly joined the betting pool yesterday. She had wagered a considerable sum of her own allowance that he would indeed use the pen. Asher made a show of uncapping the pen, sighing dramatically that he could never bear to let little Sienna lose her money. With that, he bowed low, holding the silver pen in one hand. He invited her to begin. Sienna's technique was exquisite. She moved like a storm, her attacks relentless and precise, yet with a tactical finesse that made her defense just as impenetrable. Many students would rather face the brute force of Julian than the strategic endurance of Sienna. Fighting her required immense patience and stamina. Otherwise, she would simply wear you down. However, Asher secured his victory in less than 10 moves. He never engaged her head-on. After deflecting her initial volley of strikes with deceptively simple parries, he moved to a corner of the platform. With a sweep of his arm, he unleashed a wave of his own etheric energy. Sienna was a master of combat, and her own energy reserves were not insignificant, but she couldn't withstand a tide like this. She was driven back more than a dozen steps, stumbling right off the edge of the platform. Just as she was about to hit the ground, a spinning disk of blue energy shot out from the spectator stands, cushioning her fall. Asher leaped down from the platform, grabbing her sleeve and guiding her to land safely on her feet. A core rule of the gauntlet was that the first person to touch the ground outside the ring lost. Sienna's defeat was absolute. From the high balcony, several of the senior faculty members felt the surge of powerful energy and were visibly surprised. Professor Thorne from the Clearwater Annex praised Asher's unorthodox methods, remarking that despite his occasional recklessness, his position as Blackwood's top student was well-deserved. Professor Finch, watching his student below, stated without a flicker of emotion that Asher wasn't reckless, merely possessed of youthful spirit. Over on another side, Dean Holloway of the Solstice Hall also commented that the boy's flair reminded him of a young Finch. Finch didn't hesitate to praise his student further, saying Asher was better than he had been. While most of the faculty were congratulating Finch on his protege, another dean, a man named Sterling, frowned, his expression clouded with concern. After helping Sienna to the ground, Asher let go of her arm and grinned. He told her it was a good match. At first, Sienna had been stunned by the sheer volume of energy Asher possessed, but after a moment's thought, she accepted it. Within their disciplined society, only dedicated training could yield such results. Asher had come from a common background to reach his current standing, relying on nothing but his own grit. After Asher's name was drawn for the next match against Julian, he stared intently at the student holding the lottery box. The younger boy flinched under Asher's half-smiling gaze, stammering that it wasn't his fault, that he didn't know. Asher clapped him cheerfully on the shoulder. He said he wasn't blaming him, he was just thinking how exciting it would be if he could take down Julian in one fell swoop. The young student watched Asher's confident departure with a look of pure admiration. That afternoon, before the match began, Julian was still preparing ringside when he heard Asher's voice from above. Asher was calling his name, calling him Big Brother Julian. Julian was indeed the oldest of their peer group, but hearing Asher call him, that still made him laugh. He looked up and asked what he wanted. Asher was hanging off the red satin ropes at the edge of the platform. He shamelessly asked Julian to let him have the first 3 moves. Beckett, who was giving Julian last-minute advice, rolled his eyes. He retorted, asking why Asher didn't just ask for 30 moves. Asher replied that would be even better. Julian, ever good-natured, told them to stop bickering. It was only 3 moves, it didn't matter. Asher grinned at Beckett, telling him to learn from Julian's magnanimity. He said that the day Beckett was willing to give him a handicap, he'd call him Big Brother too. Beckett scoffed that he'd give him a handicap to the head. He added that he was older than Asher anyway, so Asher should already be calling him brother. He then advised Julian to ignore Asher, calling him the type to take a mile if given an inch. Julian calmly replied that Asher was the youngest of the 4 of them, so letting him have 3 moves was fine. Silas, standing quietly nearby, offered his own piece of advice to Julian. On the 4th move, he suggested Julian should manifest a centipede and throw it in Asher's face. That would guarantee a win. As he finished speaking, Silas raised a hand without looking, effortlessly catching the pen Asher had thrown down at him. Asher, draped over the ropes, complained for Silas to stop trying to get him killed. Silas toyed with the silver pen in his palm. He told Asher he should be grateful he wasn't competing in the gauntlet himself. Asher shot back that he was truly grateful for the mercy of not being killed. He then held out his hand, brazenly demanding his pen back. Silas tossed it up to him. Before the match started, Beckett gave Julian a final pep talk. He told him to beat Asher and knock him down a peg. Silas's advice was more succinct. Just beat him. Julian set aside his usual training staff and took up the gleaming rapier he used for serious duels. When he stepped onto the platform, he saw Asher waiting, his silver pen having transformed into a slim, deadly stiletto. Julian smiled, asking if he wasn't using the pen this time. Asher replied with a grin of his own. He said Julian wasn't like Beckett. Julian had taken the top spot in the gauntlet from him twice before. He had to take this seriously. Below, a vein throbbed in Beckett's temple. He muttered, asking if he could throw a few sharp objects up there to burst Asher's head. Silas didn't answer, merely tilted his head back to watch the platform, a hand rising to his lips, an unexpected glimmer of anticipation in his eyes. The moment the starting gong sounded, Asher seized the initiative, lunging forward with his stiletto. Julian, true to his word, spent the first 3 attacks only dodging, never drawing his own blade to parry. He truly gave Asher a 3-move advantage. His mentor, Dean Holloway, frowned slightly at Julian's casual approach. But once the 3rd move passed, Julian's left hand blurred, drawing his rapier. The sword flashed like a bolt of lightning, its energy erupting like a thunderstorm. Asher saw the danger and was forced to retract his attack, shifting to a defensive stance. But Julian's offensive was overwhelming. With a single draw of his blade, several new rips appeared in Asher's shirt. Forcing Asher back, Julian threw his rapier into the air, his hands forming a complex gesture. A crimson cloud of energy materialized, and from it, 7 phantom blades emerged, creating a swirling vortex of wind that enveloped Asher. Julian then stepped into the formation, disappearing along with him. For a time, the audience could only hear the clash of metal and the ceaseless flow of brilliant, blade-shaped energy. The moment Asher vanished into the storm of blades, Leo saw the fresh cuts on his body. His face went pale with alarm, and he almost rushed forward, crying out Asher's name. Caleb grabbed his arm, pulling him back. Caleb shook his head, but his own eyes were fixed on the platform, filled with just as much worry. Julian was the finest swordsman among the 4 academies, his energy manipulation second to none. His swords were also of the highest quality. For Asher to fight him blade to blade was a huge disadvantage. Moreover, Julian had 7 phantom blades, while Asher had only his single, ordinary stiletto. Asher's idle quill, his versatile pen, was actually at a significant disadvantage as a combat weapon. It seemed capable of transforming into anything, but in reality, it was a composite tool Asher had forged from various scavenged magical artifacts. The properties of each component could not conflict. For example, if Asher found a rare, magically infused wooden dagger and a top-grade golden spear, fusing them would cause the pen to self-destruct due to the elemental conflict of metal destroying wood. Therefore, Asher had to carefully balance the elemental properties of every piece he integrated into the pen. To avoid catastrophic failure, he only used components with stable, less overwhelming powers. So, while the idle quill was incredibly versatile, none of its forms were as powerful as a dedicated, specialized weapon. Caleb believed that for Asher to win this fight, he would have to continuously shift the pen's form to find an opening. It was a conclusion everyone in the audience had reached. Even Julian, his opponent, thought the same. Clang. Before long, a sharp, clear sound of a blade shattering echoed from within the swirling red mist, ringing out over the arena. Silas stated with certainty that Asher had lost. Beckett was already starting to gloat, muttering that it served Asher right for being so arrogant. On the high balcony, Professor Finch leaned forward, his eyes filled with concern as he stared into the vortex. A wooden bead in the bracelet he was fidgeting with cracked, but he didn't notice. His intense focus prompted Dean Sterling to cough and quietly remind him not to be so obvious. Finch waved him off, telling him to be quiet. Clang. When the second shattering sound came, flames erupted from the vortex. Illusory afterimages of white and pale blue blades clashed like falling stars, the impacts sending vibrations through the very air, making the hearts of those nearest the platform tremble. Silas's expression grew serious. He murmured that something wasn't right. The third and fourth shattering sounds came in rapid succession. The platform groaned and rumbled, and then half of it suddenly collapsed. The officials standing nearby were caught off guard, scrambling to dodge the falling debris. The vortex of the duel rose into the air. Asher and Julian continued their fight, suspended above the broken stage, but the specifics of their struggle were impossible to discern, even for the senior faculty. The fifth shattering sound released a wave of terrifyingly pure energy that made many of the younger, less experienced students cry out and cover their ears. Silas pressed a hand to his chest, protecting his weak heart, and coughed twice, his face paling. Beckett's expression as he looked at the 2 combatants had completely changed. The sixth sound was very faint, swallowed by the swirling currents of energy around them. Sparks flew in the chaos of red and blue light, the tips of their blades tracing spirals and brilliant arcs in the air, a dizzying spectacle. When the 7th and final shattering sound rang out, Beckett gasped in disbelief. He wondered aloud if Asher had really broken all 7 of Julian's swords. Silas, gently rubbing his chest, frowned and corrected him. Asher's own sword had broken as well. Beckett asked when. Silas replied that it had broken at the same time as Julian's 7th. With the formation of the 7 swords broken, shards of the phantom blades rained down like snow. Asher swept away the lingering mist and burst from the vortex. He was covered in bloody cuts, his clothes in tatters. Just as Silas had said, the stiletto in his right hand was snapped in 2, but his left hand gripped the broken-off half of the blade. He spun in midair, a hawk diving for its prey, and shot directly toward Julian, who was now disarmed. Julian steadied himself, holding his own broken rapier, and charged to meet him. In the instant they passed each other, the sleeve of Asher's right arm was sliced open with a sharp rip. And on the side of Julian's neck, a shallow, bleeding cut appeared. The final gong of the match sounded. The rules stated that whoever remained on the platform last, or who could first land a decisive mark on their opponent, was the winner. Having defeated Julian, Asher's position as the Gauntlet champion was secure. No one else could challenge his rank. Professor Finch was on his feet before anyone else, shouting his approval. Dean Sterling, his face dark, tugged on Finch's arm, but Finch paid him no mind, his normally lazy eyes shining with genuine delight. He pointed at Asher on the platform below, proudly telling everyone to look, that was his student. Asher staggered for a couple of steps before finding his balance. He turned to see Julian walking toward him, a gracious, easy smile on his face as he offered his congratulations. Asher broke into a wide, brilliant grin. He changed the broken stiletto back into his fountain pen. Right there, in front of Julian, he clicked it open with a flourish. On the gleaming silver barrel, inscribed in an ancient, golden script, were the words, "In all the world, who else but me?" Underneath was the signature, "Gauntlet Champion, Asher Vance of Blackwood." Beckett stared. He swore, asking if Asher could be any more shameless. Even Julian, after a moment of shock, doubled over with laughter. He asked if Asher had written that on there beforehand, if he was that certain he would win. Asher laughed, replying that if he had lost, he just wouldn't have used a pen for the next 5 years. After speaking, the two friends fist bumped, then clasped hands and bumped shoulders. Asher had just let go of Julian's hand when he saw Leo scrambling up from the edge of the broken platform. In a few quick bounds, Leo was in front of him, throwing his arms around Asher in a tight hug. He whispered that he had been so worried. Asher was taken aback for a moment, then chuckled. He patted Leo's back, reassuring him that he was fine and telling him to get down. Leo refused, clinging to him like a limpet. Asher sighed in resignation. He simply adjusted his grip, hoisted the stubborn boy onto his shoulders, and carried him. He turned to smile at Julian, then faced the high balcony where the faculty sat. He shook his right wrist, making a small, 6-sided silver charm tied their jingle. The charm was a gift from Professor Finch from years ago. When Finch had tied it on for him, he had said he hoped Asher would become a better person than he was. Asher never understood why his mentor's expectations were so simple, but since it was his master's wish, he was determined to fulfill it. Hearing the clear chime, Professor Finch nodded slightly, a satisfied smile touching his lips. Asher returned the smile, then carried Leo off the platform. Dean Sterling's frown deepened. He commented to Finch that his student was too arrogant, too flamboyant, and that his conduct was... Finch raised his glass of whiskey, drained it, and replied with a smile in his eyes. He asked if that was such a bad thing. He said he liked him that way. As Asher carried Leo off the stage, murmurs broke out among the students below. Someone asked who the boy was. Another answered, did they not recognize him? It was that beautiful but useless kid from Blackwood. He hadn't shown an ounce of progress since his initial aptitude test. The one that no amount of special training or resources seemed to help. Yet Asher doted on him. Another whispered, wondering about the nature of Asher's relationship with him. A friend hushed them not to gossip about Asher. But the conversation continued, with someone lamenting how many female students would be heartbroken if Asher really was with that failure. Off to the side, Caleb had been watching for a long time. Unable to bear the whispers any longer, he turned and walked away, his hand resting on the hilt of his training sword. By evening, the talk of Asher carrying Leo off the platform was replaced by a much more shocking piece of news. A highly touted newcomer, Evan Cole of the Skyview branch, had been knocked off the stage by Blackwood's Caleb Thorne in just a dozen moves during the afternoon matches. He had suffered 2 broken ribs and was out of the competition for good. Perhaps it was from his proximity to Asher, but Caleb's luck in the draw continued, and his next opponent was Sienna. Asher had sparred with Caleb daily and knew his fighting spirit was at its peak. His form was perfect. Filled with high hopes, Asher found a discreet spot on the sidelines to watch. Sienna had never fought Caleb before, but she would not underestimate someone who could so easily defeat Evan. She was patient, but Caleb was even more so. His every move was as fluid and precise as water, yet his attacks grew fiercer as the fight progressed, his blade work like a torrential downpour. Sienna was forced onto the defensive by his relentless, high-speed assault, the muscles in her wrist screaming from the strain. It seemed that one final blow would be enough to disarm her. But then, Caleb's form wavered, revealing a small but obvious opening. Sienna's perception was razor-sharp. To her, even the smallest gap was a chance to turn the tables. She seized the opportunity without hesitation, landing a decisive strike that sent Caleb tumbling from the platform. Seeing this, Asher's face darkened. He walked quickly toward Caleb, who was picking himself up from the ground. As he rose, Caleb met Asher's scrutinizing gaze. He hadn't expected Asher to be watching his match. He became visibly nervous and apologized. Asher told him bluntly that he knew who he should be apologizing to, and it wasn't him. He demanded to know why Caleb had left an opening at the end. Caleb looked down, mumbling that he had been careless. Asher rapped him hard on the head. Normally when Asher did this, it was a playful gesture that never hurt. But this time, the blow made Caleb's skull ache, and his face went white with pain. Asher's voice was cold as he repeated Caleb's excuse. He said he had sparred with Caleb so many times, he could tell when he deliberately created an opening for Sienna. Did Caleb think he couldn't see it? Caleb looked up in alarm, stammering Asher's name. Asher had come full of expectation, only to watch Caleb throw the match. He was in no mood for explanations. Furious, he turned and stormed away. Depressed, Asher wandered aimlessly, clicking his pen open and shut. His steps eventually led him to a secluded cove with a white sandy beach. It was late autumn now, the wind sharp and cold, but a number of energetic young students were still splashing in the frigid water. Lower-ranked students from all 4 academies gathered here. The more advanced ones swam further out, while a few first-years stayed on the shore, guarding the clothes. Seeing Asher, the students on the shore stood up and greeted him respectfully. A few of the Blackwood students in the water, who knew him well, called out enthusiastically, inviting him for a swim. Asher pulled his jacket tighter, smiling as he declined. One of the students muttered that Asher used to love swimming with them, wondering why he hadn't joined them in years. Asher picked up a pebble and tossed it into the water near the student, telling him he talked too much. He had thrown it wide on purpose. The students knew his temperament and understood he wasn't truly angry. They laughed and dispersed, returning to their games. Asher glanced around and noticed that among those waiting on the shore was Finn, the young student who had escorted him to the disciplinary council a while back. He raised a hand in greeting. Finn's cheeks flushed with excitement as he asked if Asher remembered him. Asher laughed. He said he might be a bit older than Finn, but he wasn't senile yet. While Finn was blushing, a few other lower-level students from Skyview nervously approached. They tentatively asked Asher if it was true that Caleb had been raised by him. Asher paused. He asked what about him. The student who had asked the question spoke with a sense of injustice. He demanded to know what right Caleb, an outsider with no proper lineage, had to compete in the gauntlet. Another Skyview student chimed in, saying Caleb had no control and had injured Evan out of pure revenge. He started to say that those not of their kind were truly. Evan was too aggressive and suffered the consequences of his own actions. Asher cut in before the student could say anything uglier. He told them that if they had watched the match, they would know Caleb's final move was not intended to injure Evan. It was Evan who had recklessly charged forward and been hurt as a result. He then asked who had taught them that someone from a different background was automatically a villain. The students looked at each other, speechless. Then Finn, the shy young boy, gathered his courage and spoke up in support. He thought so too, that people from different backgrounds weren't necessarily bad. Asher cleared his throat. He stated calmly that in his view, the paths of light, shadow, and spirit were all the same. No one path was inherently better or worse than another. Practitioners of shadow and spirit often used others as a medium for their own power, so their progress was naturally faster. But because power came so easily, they were more likely to lose themselves. The path of light was about cultivating one's own heart through one's own actions. It was slower, but it was harder to stray, and it was the easiest way to live with a clear conscience. However, as long as one did not cause wanton destruction and focused on self-cultivation, the differences between the three paths existed only in prejudice. He asked if they understood. The students, including Finn, all looked as if they only half-grasped his meaning. Asher patted Finn's head and turned to leave the cove. When he reached a deserted spot, he called out into the empty air, asking if he understood. Caleb emerged from behind a nearby tree, his head bowed. He started to speak, but Asher, his back still to Caleb, sighed. He said that Caleb must have been worried that if he beat Sienna, people would talk about his origins. He asked why he should care about such things. A win was a win, a loss was a loss. What was the point of being so hesitant? Caleb denied it, his face pale with the effort of holding back his emotions. It wasn't like that. Asher turned around, his tone uncharacteristically stern as he demanded to know why Caleb had thrown the match. He asked if Caleb knew that seeing him win would have made him happier than winning the gauntlet himself. Caleb's lips pressed into a thin, white line. After a long moment, he spoke softly. He asked if it was true that Asher had placed a bet on him to finish fourth in the gauntlet. Asher froze, his expression slowly shifting to one of utter disbelief. Caleb, not daring to look at him, spoke each word quietly. He said that was why he only wanted to place fourth. He didn't want Asher to lose his bet. Before he could finish, Caleb was suddenly pulled into a cool embrace. A hand with long, distinct fingers roughly tangled in his short hair, messing it up completely. "You idiot," Asher whispered. "If I had known what you were thinking, I would have bet on you to take first place." Caleb was held so tightly he felt weak for a long moment. Then his own hands, which had been hovering stiffly behind Asher's back, finally closed, pulling Asher into a death grip. He pressed his face against Asher's ear and whispered that all he wanted was to see Asher succeed. He wanted to see Asher shine. He didn't need anything for himself. Caleb's grip became desperate, frantic. Asher could barely breathe. His free hand pushed lightly against Caleb's chest. He told him to ease up. That single push sent Caleb reeling back to a distant, unreachable place. It also pushed Asher himself into an unknown darkness. He fell from one warm embrace into another that was equally warm. Forcing his eyes open, he saw a desolate, hazy sky, and at its edge, a light source that was like a moon but wasn't. Was he back here again? He heard Julian's joyful, gentle voice by his ear. "Asher, you're finally awake." Julian, with the innocent eyes of a child, called out to Luke, who was tending a fire at the mouth of a cave. He told Luke that Asher was awake and to bring some water. Asher pressed a hand to his forehead and slowly sat up, looking at Julian. The image of the high-spirited yet humble Julian from his memories, or rather, the original Asher's memories, overlapped with the image of the man before him, who now had the mind of a 5-year-old. The two images merged and then separated again. What had happened back then? What had caused Julian to become like this? What had happened to all of them? Asher's head felt like a drum about to be beaten to pieces. The slightest attempt to think sent waves of throbbing pain through his skull. He had to rely on instinct, asking the most important question first. How was Tao? Julian answered with a pained expression that Tao was hurt and resting. Then, behaving like a responsible older brother, he pulled a handful of small, colorful, foil-wrapped candies from his pocket. He reached out to pat Asher's hair, reassuringly telling him he could have some candy. Asher, without ceremony, took two. He pocketed one and unwrapped the other, placing it under his tongue. He asked, his words slightly muffled, where Leo was. Julian replied that Leo was also sleeping. Asher was surprised. He started to ask about him, but Julian was already carefully choosing his words, afraid of missing any details in his recounting. He explained that when they got trapped in the illusionary maze, he and Beckett were together. Phantoms were trying to tear out their hearts. They had only been fighting for a moment when Leo appeared. After that, Leo led them through one trap after another. The illusions kept changing. Some were grasslands, some were deserts. There were voices whispering in their ears. One voice told him that Tao was already dead. But before he even had time to panic, Leo had shattered the illusion's core. He had followed Leo to the next one. Julian's thoughts, like a child's, wandered off topic. Asher grew anxious, forcing himself to stand despite the headache. He asked again what had happened to Leo, if he was injured. Julian quickly took Asher's hand, explaining that Leo had exhausted himself breaking through the illusions. When he finally found Asher and saw him unconscious, the shock had caused him to suffer internal hemorrhaging, and he had coughed up blood relentlessly. Asher had been unconscious for 3 days and 3 nights. Leo had refused to sleep, staying by his side the entire time, saying he would wait until Asher woke up. He had only just collapsed from exhaustion, which was why Julian was now watching over him. The moment Asher heard coughed up blood relentlessly, his mind went blank. He didn't hear the rest of what Julian said. Barefoot, he hurried toward the back of the cave. Tao was lying on a pile of dry hay, his brow furrowed and his skin pale. But compared to Leo, whose face was ashen like a corpse, Tao at least looked alive. Leo was curled up at the very edge of the makeshift bed, as if deliberately isolating himself from the others. He looked small and utterly alone, his slender wrists and ankles looking as if they could be snapped with one hand. From Asher's perspective, he looked like a child throwing a tantrum after being wronged. Asher lowered his voice, asking why they hadn't let Leo sleep next to him. Julian mimicked Asher, whispering back that Leo had said it was draftier where Asher was, and that he would sleep more comfortably alone. Asher agreed that it was indeed draftier by the entrance. He asked Julian to please carry Tao outside to sleep. Julian complied, carefully lifting the sleeping Tao and protecting his head as he carried him out, wary of the jagged rocks. Asher walked over to Leo. He first slid his right arm, the one missing a hand, under Leo's ribs. Then he wrapped his other arm around his waist, feeling his way up the vertebrae until he could grasp his own empty sleeve, ensuring a firm grip before slowly pulling Leo's upper body up. He wanted to move him to the center of the hay bed. His movements were as gentle as if he were handling spun cotton. However, he had barely lifted him when Leo's arms shot out and locked around him. They rolled over several times in the hay, Leo pressing Asher down, burying his face in Asher's shoulder and murmuring softly that he'd caught him. Asher found it amusing. He tilted his head, rubbing his chin against Leo's hair, and asked if he was awake. Leo didn't answer. His fingers traced a slow path down Asher's back, finally coming to rest on his tailbone. With a light press, a jolt shot through Asher's entire body. He gasped, nearly swallowing his tongue. He never would have imagined that he had such a sensitive spot there. A single touch and he felt like he was melting. It was as if an animal were slowly licking and biting at his very core. Remembering Julian was just outside, Asher bit back a moan, instead kicking out and scattering the hay beneath them. But Leo's reaction was even more urgent. He pressed against Asher, seeking something, his teeth clenched in a desperate effort of self-control. Asher sensed something was wrong. He grabbed the back of Leo's neck, lifting him like a kitten. He saw that the crimson markings on Leo's brow and at the corners of his eyes were a vivid, bleeding red. His breaths came in hot gasps against Asher's chest. Leo pleaded for Asher not to be afraid, not to move. He promised he wouldn't bite, wouldn't drink his blood. A torrent of pain was trapped in his throat, churning like boiling water. He struggled to get off Asher, but his arms were weak, and he kept falling back into Asher's embrace. Looking at Leo like this, Asher felt a heavy weight in his chest. Leo was born a celestial demon, his body forged from the essence of heaven and earth. He could survive just by absorbing etheric energy. He didn't need to feed on blood like common demons. Asher didn't know how a creature like him could have fallen so low. Perhaps it was because the original Asher had spoiled him too much. Or perhaps it was because of the terrible backstory he, the author, had written for him. To be honest, at this point, Asher could no longer clearly distinguish the line between fiction and reality. If he didn't clearly remember having a father named Ethan Vance and a sister named Willow, he might truly believe he was the real Asher. But at the end of the day, whether he was the author or the character, he had to take responsibility for Leo. He sighed. He told Leo that if it was unbearable, he should just drink his blood. Leo shook his head violently, refusing. Asher pulled open the collar of his shirt, exposing his collarbone. He pressed his fingertips against the skin just above it, making the pale blue veins stand out. He told him to bite there. Leo's eyes widened with hunger, but he forced himself to turn his face away. His voice now laced with tears as he begged Asher not to. A layer of moisture welled up in his crimson eyes. Asher found the sight strangely amusing. He didn't waste any more words, simply reached out and pressed Leo's head toward his collarbone. He told him to drink, that there was no need for all this fuss. The immediate scent of blood finally shattered Leo's control. A sharp pain pierced Asher's neck. Leo latched onto him like a starving puppy, drinking greedily. The desperate sounds of his swallowing and sucking made Asher blush for some reason. Soon, Asher began to feel cold, his palm feeling as if it were holding a block of ice. In contrast, Leo's body felt like a blazing fire, as if he wanted to pull Asher in and burn with him into a pile of red-hot coals. The cold made Asher drowsy. He closed his eyes and drifted into unconsciousness. After drinking his fill, the crimson marks on Leo's face had not faded. He licked his lips, then leaned in and kissed Asher. His movements were surprisingly skillful. He first sealed Asher's mouth, then cautiously extended the tip of his tongue, teasing and probing at his lips. Finally, he slipped inside, a soft, sweet warmth slowly invading Asher's mouth. The unconscious Asher shuddered, a tingling, itching sensation spreading through him, as if a small, rough-tongued kitten were playfully exploring inside. But it seemed this was exactly what he liked. He was slowly drained of his last bit of strength. He heard someone call his name in a sweet, muffled voice. For some reason, the word filled Asher's heart, and he fell into a peaceful sleep. When Asher awoke, his limbs ached. He raised a hand to touch the spot on his neck where he had been bitten. It was completely healed. However, he only had to turn his head slightly to see a patch of blood-soaked hay not far from him. He was still in the cave, the hay beneath him neatly arranged. Leo was sitting far away from him, his shoulders trembling violently. Asher tested his strength and found he could still move. He pushed himself up into a sitting position and called Leo's name. Leo turned around, his eyes full of tears that began to stream down his face. Asher asked why he was crying. Getting a full meal and still crying. What a difficult little monster. Leo didn't speak, just looked at Asher and wept, the silent tears making Asher's heart ache. He couldn't stand it for more than a minute. He beckoned gently to Leo, telling him to come over. Leo obediently crawled over to him on all fours like a kitten. He whimpered his accusation, blaming Asher for letting him drink his blood. He claimed he could have resisted. He said that when he woke up and saw Asher lying so still, he thought he paused, his voice thick with grievance. and accused Asher of seducing him. Seduction. What a ridiculous accusation. But on reflection, Asher realized he had been a bit reckless. For Leo, when he was in that state, he was not in his right mind. Tasting blood was like a starving man finding a feast. He couldn't stop. When he came to his senses and saw Asher, pale and unconscious with a bleeding neck, he must have been scared out of his wits. Thinking of this, Asher, still dizzy from the blood loss, felt a pang of guilt. He patted Leo's hair and conceded that it was his fault. He told him to stop crying, that he sounded like a little girl. Leo burrowed into Asher's chest, and after a few comforting strokes, his ruffled fur seemed to settle. He opened a small dimensional pouch at his belt and took something out. He told Asher he was giving him his hand back. He held a finely carved wooden hand with great care, preparing to attach it for Asher. The wound on Asher's right wrist must have been treated by Rena, as the raw edges were now smooth. But Leo's movements were still incredibly gentle, as if he were afraid of hurting the long-healed injury. As Leo brought the wooden hand closer, Asher noticed something. He told him to wait, that this wasn't his hand. Leo lied without blinking, insisting that it was. Asher protested that his hand was made of pear wood. But this one, Leo finished for him, saying it was sandalwood. Asher tried to argue again, but Leo looked up, his eyes brimming with tears, and insisted fiercely that this was his hand now. He forbade him from using the one Caleb had made for him. Asher's heart softened at the sight of the fierce little kitten. He relented. He had wanted to explain that the hand was a gift from his father and he had grown used to it over the years, but explaining would have been pointless. He had no choice but to accept Leo's assumption. However, after attaching it, Asher was pleasantly surprised. It was a perfect fit. He rotated his wrist. He was about to ask Leo when he had made it for him when Leo leaned in close. He said that this hand looked better on Asher. Asher smiled, replying that it was still fake. Leo looked at him earnestly. He said that as long as it belonged to Asher, it was real and it was good. The words struck Asher like a blow. It was a heartbreaking statement, especially since the Asher lying here now was, to Leo, a giant lie. Asher felt a sudden unease. He said he was going for a walk. Leo tried to push him back down, insisting that he needed to rest. Asher replied that he'd been lying down for days and was getting stiff. He easily overpowered Leo, who was reluctant to use his full strength, and pinned him to the hay. He told Leo that he was the one who needed to rest, and not to get up. Leo, lying on his back, made a small request. He wouldn't get up if Asher gave him a kiss. Asher laughed. The ancient demon before him once again perfectly matched the one in his memories. This brought Asher a strange sense of joy and relief. He leaned down and kissed the crimson mark on his forehead. Leo then lay obediently still. Before Asher left the cave, Leo reminded him to be careful. The Phantom Lord might return. It wasn't a matter of might, it was a certainty. Asher placed a hand over his heart. A fragment of Finn's soul was now inside him. Knowing the Phantom Lord Nolan's personality, he would definitely come back to reclaim it. The sad part was, Asher had searched his entire being and couldn't find a trace of the soul fragment. It might have already been consumed by his own soul. After all, that soul had been so fragile as Finn himself. Nolan was an absolute monster, but what had the young boy who believed that people from different backgrounds aren't necessarily bad done to deserve this? At the same time, Asher was deeply troubled by the half-finished sentence Nolan had uttered as his plan failed. You were once cleansed. Cleansed? Cleansed of what? Nolan's power and experience were immense. He shouldn't have failed when he was so close to his goal. Therefore, something must have happened to Asher that was beyond his control. It wasn't hard to guess the rest of the sentence was soul cleansed. But the idea was absurd. The only time Asher could think of when he might have been soul cleansed was when he was forcibly pushed into the original Asher's body upon entering this desolate land. But the experience then was completely different from what he had felt this time. Asher couldn't come up with a reasonable explanation. Agitated, he walked out of the cave. Luke, who was tending the fire outside, saw him and quickly stood up. He commented on Asher's pale complexion. Asher knew he probably looked like death after having his blood drained. He waved a hand dismissively, saying it was nothing, just dizziness from waking up. He asked where Rena and Aspen were. Luke replied that they had gone hunting. Asher then asked about Beckett. Behind his mask, Luke's eyes lowered slightly. He quietly informed him that Beckett was 100 paces west, then 600 paces south from there. Asher was curious, asking if he was alone. Luke pursed his lips, choosing his words carefully before answering that he was with his body. Asher said oh, and had taken a few steps before the meaning of Luke's words sank in. He had found it? Yes, Luke confirmed softly. That was the area where he had met his end years ago, and so had Beckett's sister. He said that Beckett had been searching for 3 days and had finally found it. He had asked to be alone with his remains for a while. The landscape was one of withered grass and dying trees, illuminated by the setting sun. Beckett sat alone, his spear at his side. The phantom-forged spear that Nolan had shattered had been repaired and was now stuck in the ground, its red tassel fluttering in the wind like a leaping dragon. Before Asher got close, Beckett picked up a rock and threw it in his direction without turning his head. He told Asher he wanted to be alone, to go away. Asher picked up the rock and squatted down. He said he wouldn't come closer, he would just stay there. He told Beckett that if it got too quiet, he could call him over to break the silence. Beckett didn't reply, so Asher just squatted there, idly opening the fan he always carried. He saw the 8 bold characters on it, "In all the world, who else but me," and traced the powerful brushstrokes with his finger. The golden script was sharp and unyielding, full of a youthful, forward-moving spirit. After a while, Beckett patted the ground beside him, gesturing for Asher to come over. Asher stood up, stamped his feet, and walked forward. As he got closer, he saw that Beckett was sitting on the edge of a deep pit, about 15 feet deep. His legs dangled over the edge. Asher looked down into the pit. There lay a skeleton that had been there for 13 years, a long spear piercing its right collarbone. Asher recognized it as the steel-forged spear that, in the original's memories, Beckett had always carried. Asher was about to say something, but Beckett shushed him. Suddenly, a long, mournful groan emanated from the pale skeleton. Then, flesh and skin began to grow over the bones. Soon, at the bottom of the pit, there was another Beckett, the Beckett from 13 years ago. The Beckett who had encountered the Phantom Lord. 13 years ago, the 5 or 6 fellow students with him were all killed and thrown into the pit. His right collarbone was pierced by a spear, his left arm was broken in 3 places, and both his legs were twisted at unnatural angles. Lying at the bottom of the pit, he was still shouting curses. The perpetrator, the Phantom Lord Nolan, ignored him and left. When he returned, he squatted at the edge of the pit, a gentle smile on his face. He told Beckett that he had just checked on his sister. It seemed she had died from postpartum hemorrhage. There was blood everywhere. She was already gone when he got there, but he assured Beckett that he could rest easy. He had shattered her soul before it could fully form, so she wouldn't be coming back as a ghost. Hearing this, Beckett's eyes nearly burst from their sockets as he screamed obscenities. Nolan continued, his voice ethereal, saying that this was the fate of all hypocrites who fell into his hands. He pointed into the distance, cupping a hand to his ear with a malicious grin. He asked Beckett if he could hear it. His sister had given birth to a beautiful baby girl. She was crying when he had found her. But he had no interest in such a small child, so he had left her for Beckett. He told him to listen to her cries and cherish them. In a couple of days, she wouldn't be able to cry anymore. Beckett tried to struggle, but the spear held him fast, his pierced collarbone preventing him from summoning any energy. He refused to believe Nolan's words, shouting his sister's name, Sienna, at the top of his lungs, telling her brother was here and to answer if she could hear him. Nolan left, laughing. Soon, the faint, eerie sound of a flute drifted on the wind, accompanied by the cries of a baby, which gradually faded into the distance. Beckett lay at the bottom of the pit as time passed silently. A day or maybe two went by. He could no longer hear his niece's cries. Perhaps the child had died, or perhaps she had been taken or killed by someone in this desolate land. There was no way to know. Trapped in the pit, unable to move, he stared up at the small patch of sky. For the first few days he cursed and screamed, but no one heard him. Then his voice grew hoarse, worn away by the sand and wind. Later, insects began to crawl over his body, burrowing into his wounds to feast on his flesh, and he could do nothing. He spent the last 16 days of his life in this sunless pit. The hope in Beckett's eyes slowly faded to gray, then was covered by layers of shadow, until finally, a deathly despair consumed him. The vibrant, flamboyant life of Beckett ended in a dark, dusty pit in a barren land. In the final moments of the Beckett in the pit, Asher clearly heard him use his raw voice to frantically call out several names. Sienna, Julian, Silas, Asher. He cried Asher's name last. After calling out these names, the last spark of light in the eyes of the Beckett below was extinguished. His flesh disintegrated, turning to dust, leaving only a pale skeleton. Soon, the Beckett returned, mechanically replaying the last moments of his life over and over again. Beckett sat on the edge of the pit, watching his own death with his other half, his fragmented soul. Asher sat beside him, silently watching it all again. Beckett was a dark ghost, a soul who had lost its memories. The only reason a ghost became a dark ghost was because its death was so traumatic that its soul shattered, its spirit fragmented, the pain so intense that it refused to remember its own demise. After watching it again, Beckett actually smiled. He remarked that he had called Asher's name before he died. He said his mind must not have been clear then. Asher didn't know what to say. He apologized, saying that if he had been there, Beckett looked down, a bitter smile on his lips. He said 13 years had passed, what was the point of talking about it now? He looked down at his own face from 13 years ago, muttering to himself that when he was a student, he often didn't understand the meaning of certain poems. He had thought they were just melodrama, but now he understood. He pointed his finger toward the bleak sky, drawing out his words. He recited, "The crane is gone from the lonely cliff. Is my old friend still here? The old world is filled with new sorrows. I wish to buy wine and flowers to share, but it is no longer." His voice trailed off on the last line. He reached out to pat Asher's shoulder. No longer like the days of our youth. The hand he had intended to place on Asher's shoulder passed right through his body without resistance. Beckett stared at his translucent fingertips and laughed bitterly. He remembered that he was already dead. He placed his hand on the edge of the pit, his fingers tightening, sending trickles of dirt down to the bottom, covering the white bones with another thin layer of dust. But a moment later, a hand slowly passed through his, overlapping it. Beckett looked down, asking what Asher was doing. Asher looked out at the vast wasteland. He said he was comforting him, afraid he might get ideas and jump. Beckett shivered. He told Asher to get lost, that it was disgusting. But he didn't pull his hand away. He commented that Asher seemed to be doing well with Caleb all these years. He asked why he had to come back to this barren land. After a long pause, Beckett spoke again. He said it was just his bad luck to run into that bastard Nolan right after he was thrown in here. Why did Asher have to come looking for trouble? Asher was inexplicably reminded of the Blackwood disciple who had abducted him, Heather. He asked if Beckett had any regrets. Regrets? Beckett shrugged. His only regret was not being able to protect Sienna. Lying down there, he had kept thinking, what was the point of living? It would be better to be dead and have some peace. But it turned out that there was no peace even in death. With that, Beckett looked up and cursed the heavens. Asher warned him to be careful or he might get struck by lightning. Beckett looked up and shouted, asking if it could hear him. Of course, there was no response. Beckett pointed at the sky and said that it couldn't hear. In this desolate land, there was no such thing as divine providence. Asher sighed, saying he was just like when they were kids. Arguing with him wasn't enough. Now he was arguing with the heavens. Was he addicted to arguing? Asher himself was a bit surprised. He had wanted to find some comforting words for Beckett, but as soon as he opened his mouth, the teasing words came out on their own. The somber atmosphere was instantly broken. Beckett looked like he wanted to strangle Asher, but Asher found this version of Beckett much more lively and interesting. So he continued with a sigh, saying his arguing skills were impressive, but his fighting skills were just average. Beckett spat. He retorted that Asher wouldn't think so when he was pinning him down and beating him up later. Asher was about to say something else when he suddenly felt a chilling presence behind him. He spun around to see a swirling cloud of black dust rushing toward them, instantly engulfing the man and the ghost at the edge of the pit. Was it coming for him? Was it Nolan? The change was so sudden that Beckett's face paled. To protect Asher from falling into the newcomer's hands, he roared, unleashing a wave of power that sent Asher tumbling headfirst into the pit. The spear at his side flew out at his command, cutting a white arc through the air like a shooting star, pinning Asher's fluttering coat to the side of the pit. Asher's body slid down a few feet before the spear held him fast. He sighed. Beckett was a true friend. However, when the dust settled, Asher's expression changed completely. A long, ghost energy-infused saber was embedded in Beckett's side. Flecks of red blood foamed at his lips. Nolan pulled the blade out. He said that, just like before, a simple feint was enough to distract him. He let the blood and flesh pour from the wound. He taunted him, asking if he hadn't learned anything after dying once. Nolan's words were mocking, but in the few days since they had last seen him, his eyes had become bloodshot and his lips were covered in blisters. He had clearly been through several cycles of torment and revival. He kicked Beckett aside. Only a ghost weapon could harm a ghost servant. A large patch of blood bloomed on Beckett's chest, soaking his clothes. Asher screamed his name. As soon as the words left his mouth, a powerful force seized Asher, lifting him up. The spear pinning him to the pit wall came loose and fell to the bottom, scattering the bones of Beckett's skeleton that lay there. A few of the bones cracked. A faint light flickered between the broken fragments, as if sensing something. The steel-forged spear wedged in the collarbone emitted a faint, almost inaudible hum. Nolan had no intention of wasting time. He didn't have much time to waste. He held out the now empty soul-locking jade flask he had been carrying. A vast field of pure golden energy had already sealed off a 100-meter radius around them, isolating all energy fluctuations from the outside world. He clearly knew this trick wouldn't fool Leo for long. Therefore, every word he spoke was laced with urgency. He demanded that Asher give him back the young acolyte's soul. Asher's hair was a mess, a few strands hanging in his face. His voice was thick with suppressed fury. He said that he was dead. Nolan's face twisted for a moment. He snarled that in that case, Asher could pay with his own life. Before he finished speaking, Nolan's fingertips had torn open the left side of Asher's chest. Blood immediately gushed out. Asher let out a roar of pure rage, ignoring the pain. He bent his right arm to block Nolan's chest, while his left hand shot toward Nolan's forehead. Nolan was about to sneer, but the next moment, the smile died on his face. A pure, raw energy clamped down on him like a giant hand, reaching into his skull, as if trying to crush him from the inside out. A torrent of violent energy washed over Nolan. For a moment, he felt a genuine fear, as if a hand had passed through his chest and was toying with his heart. His head throbbed. He had no time to wonder how Asher, who had seemed like an ordinary human just days ago, possessed such power. He threw him off. Asher slammed into a dead tree several feet away and fell to the ground. He tried to get up, but the surge of energy seemed to have completely drained him. He only managed to push himself halfway up before collapsing to his knees. The uncontrolled energy rampaged through his chest like fleshy vines, churning his organs, making him feel sick. A wave of immense anger rose in Nolan's chest. He couldn't believe he had just been terrified by this person who couldn't even get up after one fall. The thought alone was a humiliation. Nolan was about to unleash his power and make Asher's heart explode when a strange, chilling whirlwind suddenly erupted from the deep pit. It lunged at Nolan like a hungry wolf, shattering the energy he had just summoned. Nolan turned his head in astonishment, and Asher, with all his might, managed to sit up. He had thought it would be better to die sitting than lying down, but he never expected to see what happened next. Beckett stood up. The steel-forged spear in his hand seemed to have merged with the bulging veins on the back of his hand. His simple clothes had transformed in an instant into a flowing, dark blue robe, the shoulders and sleeves embroidered with shimmering gold thread. He twirled the long spear tassel. The sharp point hissed as it cut through the air, emitting a short, sharp cry like a wild goose, clear and chilling. It was as if a beacon fire were burning in the light reflected from the blade. And there stood Beckett, the faint purple cloud pattern on his forehead replaced by a long, narrow, burning flame pattern, like a hateful eye had opened there. His left fingertips dripped with blood. On the side of his neck was a complex rune, drawn stroke by stroke in blood. He would not let Nolan take anyone from his side again. Beckett's voice was filled with an unspeakable coldness. He repeated his vow. Nolan, after a moment of shock, asked if Beckett had used a forbidden spell just to save this person's life. Then he burst out laughing. He mocked him, a man of a disciplined path, for willingly sinking so low. First a ghost servant, now a vengeful wraith? But he reminded Beckett that he was the Phantom Lord. He was the master of ghosts. No matter what kind of monster he became, he was no match for him. With that, he drew a complex sigil in his palm and launched it at the center of Beckett's forehead. But Beckett vanished in an instant. The sigil missed, striking a massive tree that two people couldn't encircle and splitting it in two. Of course, no sound from within this 100-meter area could reach the outside world for now. Nolan frowned, looking around. Among all ghosts, wraiths were indeed the most difficult to deal with. Their power was several times that of an ordinary spirit. If Beckett had simply found the other half of his lost soul core, he would still be no match for the Phantom Lord Nolan. Therefore, the reason for his self-degradation was not hard to guess. Nolan found it laughable. Did he really think he could kill him? This useless creature, how could he even get close? He taunted him, daring him to show himself. The only sound was the howling of the wind in the desolate wilderness. Nolan even began to suspect that Beckett, having heard his words and fearing for his own existence, had already taken the opportunity to flee. He didn't want to bother with Beckett. All he wanted was Finn's soul fragment. Whether Asher was telling the truth or not, whether Finn was already gone from his body, Nolan had no intention of letting him live. He could just kill him, seal his soul within his body, and then slowly extract Finn's soul later. With this thought, a black, ethereal nail formed in Nolan's palm. It floated eerily, then split into 2, then 4. In an instant, 12 deadly black stars shot toward Asher. However, none of the nails hit him. After a series of clanging sounds, they fell to the ground like shooting stars. In front of Asher, a tall, shadowy figure had appeared, blocking all the attacks with a spear. Nolan sneered. He called him a fool for seeking death. He might fail once, but he would not fail a second time. The sigil he had been hiding in his left palm shot out, a flash of lightning aimed directly at the shadow. He watched as the shadow, unable to dodge, had a chain-like brand appear around its neck. The entire soul was suspended in mid-air as if pierced by a wooden stake, unmoving. A faint smile touched Nolan's lips. However, the smile had barely formed before it died completely on his face. He looked down in disbelief. When he saw the fist-sized, bloody hole in his chest, he even reached out to touch it. When his hand came away wet, His vision blurred, and he couldn't tell if the blood covering his palm was red or black. He had never heard his own heartbeat so clearly before. But now, that heart was gone, beating like a frightened rabbit before his eyes. Beckett had passed through his body and calmly taken his still-beating heart. Asher stared at Beckett, speechless. The flame pattern on Beckett's forehead grew even more distinct, casting an eerie, pale green light in his eyes. He turned his wrist, examining Nolan's heart from all angles, and spoke softly. He asked Nolan if he had forgotten that he had once torn him in two. One half had lain here for 13 years. The other half was so useless it had forgotten to seek revenge. Asher understood. The half-soul that had just protected him was a decoy that the Wraith Beckett had deliberately split off to attract Nolan's attention. Blood gushed from Nolan's mouth, a gurgling sound in his throat. He fell to the ground, powerless. He propped himself up with his hands and began to crawl slowly forward. He told the Wraith to take the useless half-soul if he wanted it. The Wraith Beckett laughed softly. He said it already belonged to him. It was just a matter of whether Nolan had the life left to enjoy it. Nolan spat out a mouthful of blood. He dragged himself forward on his elbows across the rough ground. The Wraith Beckett stepped on his back, but Nolan, with all his remaining strength, still managed to grab what he wanted. The now empty soul-locking jade flask that he had just dropped. He frantically clutched the flask to his chest, as if he had forgotten that the soul inside was already gone. The Wraith Beckett had apparently lost interest in Nolan's heart. He tossed it aside like a piece of trash. The red heart rolled a few times, picking up bits of grass and dirt. The Wraith raised his spear and plunged it straight into the pathetic heart. Asher squeezed his eyes shut, but couldn't avoid hearing the sickening, squelching sound. The Wraith Beckett slowly twisted the spearhead. He said he had promised to run him through the heart and personally grind his bones to dust. He hadn't forgotten, but Nolan could no longer hear Beckett's words. He held the jade flask in his arms, murmuring in a low voice, asking his little acolyte if he was hurt. No one could answer his question. Or rather, even if someone could, he could no longer hear them. But Nolan didn't know that. He looked at the flask with anticipation, waiting for his little acolyte to say something to him. After the acolyte's death, he would wait like this every night before falling asleep, asking him in his heart what he wanted. Food, clothes, anything, just come to his dreams and tell him, and he would provide it. But the little acolyte would not forgive him. He was so stingy he wouldn't even enter his dreams once. He just kept waiting until he fell asleep. This time, Nolan waited as always, until the light of life in his eyes finally faded. The moment Nolan died, the shield of energy that had been blocking the area vanished. The sigil that had just been imprinted on the other half of Beckett's soul, which had not yet had time to merge with him, also dissipated. That half of the soul scattered like smoke and re-entered the Wraith Beckett's body. But the Wraith Beckett was in no hurry to destroy Nolan's corpse. He sniffed the air and, as if smelling something interesting, turned to look at Asher. He noted that there was a fresher heart here. Asher was suddenly alarmed. He called out Beckett's name. Hundreds of paces away, Leo, who had been lying obediently on the hay, suddenly sat up as if he had sensed something. Beckett. Beckett. Was that his name? The Wraith Beckett licked the blood from his fingertips, savoring the name. Not bad. He asked Asher for his name. Asher watched him warily. The person before him had Beckett's face and voice, but he was completely transformed, just a skin suit for the entity within. The Wraith Beckett gave up asking, bringing the steel-forged spear back into his hand. He spun it around and said that knowing the name of his food didn't matter. Beckett's mind was gone. His eyes glowed with a predatory, red-green light. He rolled his neck, the corners of his mouth pulling up into a sharp, cruel smirk. He started walking toward Asher, spear in hand. Asher was both shocked and furious. He shouted his name. The murderous ripples in Beckett's eyes wavered for a moment. The knife-like sharpness in his gaze suddenly softened. A look of confused tenderness appeared as he looked at Asher. But just as quickly, his expression became savage again. He snarled, asking what the other presence inside him was trying to do. He was speaking to the sliver of reason, the real Beckett, that still remained within him. Asher immediately seized upon this glimmer of hope. He backed away, shouting for Beckett to fight it, to drive it out of his body, not to let it control him. The Wraith Beckett let out a contemptuous sneer, his lips stretching into a horrifying grin. He raised the steel-forged spear, its gleaming point aimed at Asher's heart. Asher had nowhere left to retreat, but he refused to give up. He yelled for him to think of Aspen, to think of Sienna and Luke, to think about who he was, that he was Beckett. Before Asher could finish, Leo suddenly appeared, shielding him. Without a word to Beckett, a pulse of red energy gathered in his palm, locking onto the ghost core at the center of Beckett's forehead. The ghost core was the soul core, the most vulnerable part of a ghost. If Leo's attack landed, Beckett would be utterly destroyed. Asher's eyes widened. He cried out for him not to. Beckett let out a heart-wrenching scream. Just as Leo was about to strike, he managed to turn the spearhead around and plunge it into his own right collarbone. The sound of bone shattering was sickening. The Wraith Beckett, caught off guard by the original Beckett regaining control, felt the flow of energy in his body halt abruptly. Escape was now impossible. It furiously cursed the other Beckett inside him, calling him a useless piece of trash. The power of the red light in Leo's palm diminished by 70%, but its trajectory did not change, striking Beckett's ghost core. Even the Wraith could not withstand such an impact. It was instantly knocked unconscious. However, the real Beckett still clung to a sliver of consciousness. He fell to his knees, coughing violently, the steel-forged spear propping him up, forming a triangle with his body and the ground. Beckett remained unconscious for 6 days. During that time, Luke never left his side, watching over him without rest. Only a ghost master could touch a ghost servant, so even Rena couldn't treat Beckett. All his injuries were tended to by Luke. Although Asher stayed by his side, there was little he could do to help. On the 6th day, Asher went to check on Beckett early in the morning. He happened to see Luke take off the wraith mask he always wore and place it aside. He was wiping his eyes, his shoulders shaking. Asher searched his pockets and found a handkerchief that Rena had washed for him the day before. He folded it and walked over. Hearing footsteps, Luke quickly snatched up the mask and put it back on his face before turning around. He swallowed hard several times to suppress his sobs before greeting Asher. Asher told him not to cry, that it would hurt his eyes. Luke insisted he wasn't crying, even managing a weak smile to prove it. Asher walked closer and placed the handkerchief in his hand, saying, "All right, you're not crying." He sat down next to Luke, his posture as casually improper as ever, one leg crossed in front of him, the other propped up, his elbow resting on his knee, as he gazed at the unconscious Beckett, lost in thought. Luke was about to straighten up, but Asher gently but firmly pressed his head down, guiding the masked head to rest on his own shoulder. He even lowered himself a bit to accommodate Luke's height. Luke was a bit dazed. He shifted slightly against Asher, his voice still thick and nasal as he said Asher's name. Asher cleared his throat, resting his wooden hand lightly on Luke's thick hair. He whispered in his ear that no one could hear them. They were all asleep. If he wanted to cry, he could cry. He wouldn't laugh at him. Luke paused, then clutched Asher's shirt. He held back for a long time before finally letting out a long, bone-deep sob. The ghost mask, which he hadn't had time to secure properly, fell from his face and clattered to the ground. Asher let him cry. It was a long time before the sobs subsided. Asher took out the foil-wrapped candy he had been hiding in his palm, unwrapped it, and popped it into Luke's mouth. Luke sucked on it for a moment before he identified the taste. He asked if it was candy. Asher confirmed that it was. Several days after Nolan's death, his ghost servants had all dispersed. The Tiger's Leap ravine became an empty valley of the dead. In search of the key fragment to open the gate to the barren lands, Aspen and the others had scoured the entire ravine but found nothing. In the end, it was Asher who discovered the key fragment, set in a stone pendant and made into a charm, inside Finn's empty soul-locking jade flask. Asher had read Finn's memories. The reason Nolan had tricked Finn into coming back was the promise of a beautiful, auspicious place in the ravine to bury his unknown fellow acolyte. Asher had found it strange at the time. The barren lands were desolate, with almost no lush vegetation. Even the flower nectar was bitter. Where could such a place have come from? After Nolan's death, he had gone to check the lake in the ravine. He found the trees withered, the animals gone, and the lake bed dry and cracked. The entire area seemed to have had its life force drained, desolate and dead. However, he had tasted the nectar of a few wildflowers growing nearby and found it to be slightly sweet. This at least proved that the place had once been fertile. And as he reviewed Finn's memories, Asher noticed that he and Nolan often played games of fetch in that lake. Once, the young acolyte Finn had fished a strange, glowing fragment out of the water. Nolan, thinking nothing of it, had made it into a necklace and given it to him. Finn had loved the necklace and wore it every day until the day he and Nolan parted ways. After Finn's death, Nolan had placed the necklace in the jade flask with Finn's soul fragment as a companion. The key fragment was a spiritual object. Perhaps its presence in the lake had created that small paradise. Once the fragment was removed, the land had reverted to its barren state. This theory was plausible, but Asher felt a nagging sense that something was not quite right. He couldn't put his finger on it. Unable to figure it out for the time being, Asher didn't dwell on it, simply filing the strange suspicion away in his mind. Before leaving the dried-up lake, Asher had picked dozens of the dying flowers, extracted their nectar, and made 4 candies. One was for Leo, of course. He gave 2 to Julian and Aspen, and kept the last one for himself. He had originally intended to give it to Beckett when he woke up, but seeing Luke so upset, he had a moment of weakness and gave it to him instead. He asked if it was good. Luke, with the candy in his mouth, mumbled, asking if Julian got one. The thought made Asher laugh. He explained that he had given Julian his candy the night before, but he hadn't eaten it. He wouldn't even lick it. He had waited until Tao was asleep and slipped it into his mouth, nearly choking him. When Asher talked about Julian, his tone was as natural and familiar as if he were talking about a lifelong friend. Luke whispered his thanks. Asher told him that if he wanted to thank him, he should stop crying. He said his shirt was getting wet. Luke was embarrassed and quickly lifted his head, vigorously rubbing the damp spot on Asher's shoulder with the back of his hand. When he realized he had forgotten to put on his mask, he looked up in a panic, only to see that Asher had already squeezed his eyes shut. Asher gently prompted him to put it back on, saying he hadn't seen anything. In Asher's imagination, Luke must have suffered some terrible accident that had disfigured him, hence the frightening mask. Since Luke didn't want others to see his face, why should Asher pry out of idle curiosity? After a moment, he heard Luke's voice, still slightly choked with tears. Asher thought he had put the mask back on and opened his eyes. He immediately sucked in a sharp breath. He could only manage to say "you" before his voice failed him. Luke had not put the mask back on. But underneath the ghost mask was not the ruined, scarred face Asher had imagined, but a delicate, unblemished, and almost childishly cute face. Luke's eyes were large and round. Swollen from crying, they were as red and adorable as little peaches. His cheeks were pale and soft. He looked like a little squirrel who was sad about having his winter stash of nuts stolen. Asher came to his senses and asked if his face wasn't injured. Luke shook his head timidly. Asher was confused. He asked why he wore the mask then. Luke pressed his lips together, put the mask back on, and after steeling himself, finally explained. He said that in all his years of training at the Clearwater Annex, his skills were mediocre and his aptitude was average. But he had a knack for ghost lore. After entering the barren lands, he knew that if he stuck to the path of light, he would surely die. So he had abandoned it and focused on studying the path of ghosts. Later, he had found the fragmented souls of several of his senior classmates from Clearwater. Clearwater had a very strict hierarchy. His rank was low, and he felt he had no right to command his seniors, nor could he face them as a ghost practitioner. So he had found a piece of scrap metal, fashioned it into this mask, and worn it ever since. Asher patted his hair comfortingly and asked if Beckett knew. Luke replied that Beckett was the last ghost servant he had taken in. He already looked like this when Beckett first saw him. Asher was curious. He asked why he didn't tell him. He wasn't from Clearwater. Luke's ears turned bright red. He stammered that Beckett had always thought he was disfigured and would never let anyone touch his mask. Once, he had almost gotten into a fight with Aspen for trying to take it off. Since he was so protective, he felt too embarrassed to tell him. Asher found Luke's behavior a bit odd. Then he thought about Beckett's protective attitude toward Luke. And after having been forced to watch the display between Nolan and Finn, he understood. He said, "Oh, you two." He swallowed the rest of the sentence. Just from the first half, Luke's face had turned as red as a tomato. He vehemently denied it. Asher didn't comment on Luke's obvious denial. Now that Beckett had been mentioned, Luke seemed to have an endless supply of things to say. He said that when he first found him, he couldn't stand him. Beckett was angry because he couldn't remember how he died, and he took all his frustration out on him. He annoyed him so much that he almost didn't want him anymore. Asher thought about Beckett's arrogant, aristocratic demeanor and felt that Luke's annoyance was completely justified. But then, thinking that he was no longer among the living, he wasn't so angry anymore. Besides, he was the only one Beckett could interact with. If he ignored him too, he would be too miserable. The ghost mask was quite effective, twisting Luke's soft voice into something more menacing. But having seen Luke's true face whenever Asher heard him speak now, he could only picture a little squirrel sadly counting his acorns. He was beginning to understand why Luke insisted on wearing the mask. After all, his voice, his appearance, and his height were completely non-threatening. Even when he was furious, he probably just looked like a teenager throwing a tantrum. Luke's voice trembled slightly as he said that they had been together ever since. But he hadn't been able to protect him. His eyes were Luke's eyes. He should have seen Nolan coming. But at that moment, he saw how sad Beckett was after finding his own body, and he wanted to give him some time alone. At this, Luke started to cry again. He said that after all these years, he still couldn't protect anyone. Asher watched him quietly. So many years had passed, but he was still the same little ghost practitioner from the original's memories, the one who would risk his own life to save his peers. Small, prone to tears, but fiercely loyal. Asher suddenly remembered that when he first saw Luke a few days ago, he was standing on a high place, manipulating sigils to summon ghosts, a swirling vortex of spirits around him. Later, when the sealed mountain disciples came to attack the tower to retrieve the key, Luke was seriously injured because he was standing on a high place and was hit by an arrow. He seemed to have a penchant for high places, even if it meant getting hurt. Perhaps, when he was casting spells, he deliberately stood on high ground to make himself feel less small and powerless. Just like he used the ferocious ghost mask to hide his face. Luke wanted to become stronger than before, but to his dismay, when it mattered most, he was still a useless crybaby. Asher was lost in thought when he heard a weak voice from nearby. "Oh gods!" Crying again. Asher looked over and saw that Beckett, who had been lying there, had opened his eyes. Luke, stunned, immediately threw himself on top of Beckett. A ghost servant could only touch their master. The pressure on his pierced collarbone made Beckett curse out loud, asking if Luke was trying to crush him. Luke's movements became gentler, but he still refused to get off him, baring his teeth like a little wildcat, his eyes teary as he fiercely scolded him. Who told him to use a forbidden spell on himself? If he hadn't dispelled the curse in time, he would have been completely possessed by the wraith. Did he have his permission to do that? Beckett cried out in pain, begging for forgiveness. He said he was sorry and pleaded for his ancestor to get off him. Seeing this, Asher decided it was time to leave. His job was done. He quietly walked out of the cave. Inside, Luke reluctantly got off Beckett and knelt by the bed. He puffed out his cheeks, hesitating for a long time before finally telling Beckett that he had eaten candy earlier. Beckett, still recovering from the pain, was a bit slow on the uptake. He asked what he meant. Luke asked if he wanted some. Before Beckett could answer, Luke leaned down and gave him a quick, mouse-like peck on the lips, transferring a bit of the not yet fully melted sweetness. He straightened up, his face flushed, and said that was all there was, so he couldn't complain. His words were cut off. Beckett raised his uninjured left arm and cradled the back of Luke's head, pulling him back down before he could straighten up completely. He said he hadn't tasted it properly. Try again. Asher walked along, idly playing with his pen, lost in thought. Leo now had 2 pieces of the key. If the so-called world consciousness knew that he, the designated assassin, was not only failing at his job but was actively helping Leo and his friends escape, it would probably have an aneurysm. He walked out of the cave alone and ran into Rena coming the other way. He smiled and greeted her. Rena saw him and gave a slight nod. She asked where Leo was. Asher started to say that Beckett was awake and he was just looking for... His words stopped abruptly. Rena looked at him, her tone questioning. Asher turned and stared back into the cave, his eyes wide with disbelief. In that instant, he had finally figured out what was so strange about the Nolan affair. The key fragments of the barren lands were priceless treasures to anyone trapped there. But Nolan seemed to have been completely unaware that the fragment Finn had picked up was one of them. He had not only made it into a trinket for Finn, but had also let the low-powered acolyte wear it around. So, if Nolan himself didn't know it was a key, how did the captured master of the sealed mountain know that Nolan had a key fragment? The mountains rose in jagged peaks, their tops scraping the sky, dotted with twisted, ancient pines and overgrown vines. The scene, combined with the sudden appearance of the barren land's high tower, felt desolate, eerie, and utterly strange. Several disciples in Clearwater Annex uniforms were pushing Silas's wheelchair, standing before the tower. Silas's stark white hair billowed in the wind. He faced the tower, his expression calm. The 2 disciples who had been here before looked at the deadly, shifting sands on the ground with lingering fear, their legs trembling. One of them asked if it was really necessary to go in, since the others weren't in the tower and it was so dangerous. Silas gave a simple, direct order. Go in. There was still one person inside, and he had some questions for them. With Silas's command, the disciples had no choice but to obey. Steeling themselves, they pushed the wheelchair forward. The sands on the ground shifted, seeming to stir with malevolent intent. But the glowing 8-sided disc in Silas's lap pulsed with light, suppressing the sand's dark energy. The wheelchair moved smoothly forward, its wheels making a soft crunching sound. The disciples walking alongside were drenched in cold sweat. The disciple who had been here before wiped his forehead and tried to make small talk with Silas to ease the tension. He commented that Silas's wheelchair was very well made, so stable. He had been using it since the first time they met over a decade ago, so the quality must be top-notch. He asked which master craftsman had made it. Silas, without looking up, replied with 2 words: Asher Vance. The 15-year-old Silas had despised the 13-year-old Asher when they first met. He had never encountered such an irreverent, insolent rogue in his life. Even when he was sick and at his lowest, the young Silas had 2 servants to care for him day and night. His medicine was served in jade bowls. After entering the Clearwater Annex, his exceptional talent earned him the favor of his mentor, Professor Thorne, and he was promoted to head disciple within 3 years. The Clearwater Annex valued seniority and hierarchy. Even disciples who had trained for over a decade without success had to respectfully call him Senior Silas. Before meeting Asher, Silas had never had any contact with someone from a common background. One day, Professor Thorne ordered him and Asher Vance, the head disciple of the new Blackwood Dean, Professor Finch, to jointly apprehend a rogue necromancer who was causing trouble in the borderlands between their territories. When Silas, leaning on his ebony cane and accompanied by two of his junior classmates, walked out of the academy gates, he saw two young disciples in Blackwood uniforms waiting. But Asher Vance was nowhere to be seen. He frowned slightly and asked where he was. A voice called out. Silas turned his head toward the stone monolith at the entrance to Clearwater. A boy was sitting on top of it, one leg dangling down. The afternoon light cast a pale golden glow on him. The boy took a swig from a flask, the corners of his lips curving into an impossibly arrogant smirk. He said he was right there. Silas's face darkened, but he made no comment on his behavior. His upbringing had always been impeccable. If he encountered behavior he disapproved of among his own classmates, he would reprimand them. But Asher was his peer. If he didn't like him, he would simply ignore him to save himself the trouble. However, when they finally cornered the necromancer, all of Silas's composure and dignity vanished. He impulsively abandoned all his companions and pursued the man with a single-minded fury. The necromancer's power was average, but he was incredibly fast. By the time Silas chased him into a range of rolling hills, his own energy was in turmoil, his face a mottled patchwork of purple and white. His overstrained heart hammered against his ribs with a terrifying force. Even so, he refused to stop until a powerful force from behind wrapped around him, holding him in a tight embrace. Asher, who had followed him, shouted, asking if he was trying to get himself killed. Silas, in a frenzy, elbowed him in the ribs and stomach. Asher took the blows without a sound, placing a hand on the back of Silas's head and unleashing a pulse of energy. Silas felt a wave of dizziness and pitched forward, unconscious. When he woke up, he was in a cave, a simple Blackwood-style coat draped over him. Asher was squatting at the mouth of the cave, having gathered a pile of damp wood, which he was drying with his energy before adding it to a small fire. Noticing Silas was awake, he said, "Oh, you're up. You run pretty fast." The other disciples from both our schools couldn't keep up. Silas was about to speak when a dull pain flared in his chest. He hunched over, swallowing back the pain. He asked where the other man was. The necromancer? Asher tossed a small golden bell in the air and caught it. He said he was probably still in the mountains somewhere. His mentor had given him a magical artifact before he left, one that could expand to cover 100-square-mile area or shrink to trap a butterfly. He had already used it to seal off the entire mountain range. Their own people couldn't get in, but the necromancer couldn't get out either. He told Silas to rest up, and they would search the mountains for him later. Silas said nothing. He pushed himself up against the cave wall, leaning on his cane with one hand and the wall with the other, and staggered toward the entrance. Asher, already tall and long-limbed for his age, saw this and blocked the exit, planting one foot on the opposite wall. He asked where he was going. Silas, without looking at him, said coldly that it was none of his business. Asher gently pushed him back. He said they could look for the necromancer after he had rested. His mentor had told him that Silas had a heart condition and that he needed to take care of him. Silas retorted sharply, asking if he knew how he got his heart condition. When Silas had lost his composure earlier, Asher had already figured it out. He asked if it was the necromancer. Silas's every word was laced with hatred and pain. He had witnessed his parents' murder. The man had just been passing by their family's charity stall and had taken a liking to the jade pendant his father wore. He had snuck into their house, torn out his father's heart, and then assaulted his mother. His mother had hidden him under the bed just before the man entered, which was how he survived. Later, his mother's blood had seeped through the floorboards and dripped onto his face. He had done all that for a piece of jade worth no more than $1,000. Asher sucked in a breath. $1,000. Silas glared at him. Asher realized how inappropriate his comment was and quickly raised his hands in apology. He said he was sorry, he wasn't used to such things. Silas told him not to block his way, his voice strained, a vein throbbing at his temple. Asher spoke bluntly. He told him he was too weak, that if he ran into the man now, he would just get himself killed. He would go. Silas swung his cane, striking Asher's left shin. Asher, caught off guard, cried out in pain and hopped around on one foot. Silas ignored him and walked past him out of the cave. Asher wasn't angry. He hopped after him, calling out for him to wait up, that they should go together. Silas no longer had the strength to use his energy for flight. He had to search for the man who had killed his family on foot. Asher followed behind him, carefully avoiding the ants on the ground while trying to make conversation. He said it must be tiring to walk and offered to carry him. Silas, forcing his breathing to remain steady, coldly refused. Asher tried again, pointing out that a lot of his hair was white. Silas was getting annoyed. Since he had developed his heart condition, his hair had been streaked with silver. No one had ever been so rude as to mention it to his face. Asher recited a line of poetry about white hair and sorrow, then called him Frosty and told him not to be so hard on himself. Silas stopped, thinking he had misheard. He asked what Asher had called him. Asher, busy dodging ants, answered without looking up, Frosty. A nameless rage flared in Silas's mind, but he managed to suppress it before it erupted. He reminded Asher that he was older. Asher replied, so what? Beckett from the Solstice Hall was 2 years older than him too. Silas didn't want to talk to Asher anymore. For the first time, he felt that talking too much could actually cause chest pain. Asher seemed to sense Silas's mood and stopped trying to talk to him, moving to walk ahead of him. He used a branch to clear the path, muttering to himself, if others get angry, I won't. Getting angry only makes you sick, and no one will care. If I die of anger, who will be happy? Besides, it's a waste of energy. His family's killer was nearby, yet he couldn't find him. Silas was frustrated, and hearing Asher's pointed remarks was the last straw. He finally snapped, shouting at him to shut up. Asher was taken aback. He turned and explained that he was just trying to tell him not to be angry, that it was bad for his health. Of course, Silas knew Asher didn't mean any harm, but his temper had already flared. He unleashed all his anger on him. What did his health have to do with him? Who was he to tell him what to do? Asher, also a teenager, retorted without hesitation. Why was he taking it out on him? If he was really so unhappy, he could go bang his head against a tree. Silas stared at him, grinding his teeth. He said that if Asher had watched his family die in front of him, he would understand how he felt right now. Asher stopped, his back to Silas. He stood there for a long moment, then started walking forward again without a word, quickly leaving Silas several yards behind. In the Clearwater Annex, when Silas reprimanded junior disciples, no one ever dared to talk back. Now, Asher, who was younger and had started his training later, was not only disrespectful but also refused to listen. Silas's anger boiled over. He grabbed his ebony cane and threw it at Asher's back. It struck him squarely between the shoulder blades. The cane was heavy, and Asher hadn't expected it. The impact sent him to his knees, clutching his shoulder. Silas hadn't expected to actually hit him. As the heat of anger began to recede, Asher picked up the cane, stood up, and snapped it over his knee. The cane broke in two. Without a second glance, he tossed the broken pieces off the nearby cliff and walked away. Silas was so angry he nearly coughed up blood. He shouted after him. Without his cane, Silas could barely walk. The memories of the past, combined with the argument with Asher, made the pain in his chest unbearable. He hadn't gone more than half a mile before he collapsed against a tree, his hands trembling as he fumbled for the pain-relieving medicine he carried. After swallowing the pill, he passed out from exhaustion. He was woken by a jolting motion. He was lying on someone's back. The sky had turned from dusk to night. They were flying away from the mountain range on an energy platform. The golden light that had previously enveloped the mountains was gone. Silas panicked, grabbing the shoulders of the person carrying him and shouting for him to stop. Asher, who was carrying him, nearly fell off the platform. He gasped in pain, telling him to let go. Only then did Silas realize it was Asher carrying him, and that he was gripping the very spot he had hit with his cane. It was clear that Asher had other injuries as well. There were burns from ghost fire on his waist, legs, and chest. The back of his neck had been crudely bandaged with some herbs from the forest. When Silas had jostled him, the poultice had fallen off, revealing a gruesome gash. Silas's expression hardened. He asked what had happened. Asher, relieved that he was awake, found the nearest hilltop and landed, setting Silas down. He then rummaged in his sleeve and took out the golden bell. He said he had captured that bastard for him. He was trapped inside. Silas stared at the bell in front of him in astonishment. Took him a long time to find his voice. Asher scratched his head. He said the thing was cunning. It had taken him a lot of effort to capture it alive. After he caught it, he had sealed all its major energy points, so even in Silas's current state, he would have no trouble finishing it off slowly. Silas's voice trembled as he asked why he had captured it alive. His mentor had said that if the man wouldn't surrender, they could just kill him. Asher pushed the bell closer to Silas, his tone light. He said he thought that if he were in Silas's shoes, he would want to kill him with his own hands to get revenge. He was right there inside. If he wanted revenge, he should take it. Silas was speechless. The battered Asher held the golden bell, grinning at him guilelessly. After a long moment, Silas finally spoke. He said that since the man had been captured, he could no longer take personal revenge. They should escort him back to the Clearwater Annex. Asher asked why. Silas said it was the rules. Asher tossed the bell into Silas's lap. Silas was forced to catch it. Asher said that an eye for an eye was the only rule that mattered. He asked him, would killing him with his own hands make him feel better? Silas said his parents still wouldn't come back. Asher repeated the question. He wasn't asking about that. He was asking if it would make him feel better. Silas considered for a moment, then nodded slightly. Asher told him to go. Then, he turned Silas around and gave him a push. He said he would give him an hour to do whatever he wanted. Whatever would make him feel better. Silas found that after only half a day with him, he had already grown accustomed to Asher's roguish, street-smart manner. He chuckled. He said he wouldn't be able to torment him for that long. Asher sat down on a nearby rock. He told him not to lie, that he was sure he had imagined torturing the man in his nightmares. He added regretfully that if he could catch the necromancer who killed his mother, he would torment him for a day and a night, and it still wouldn't be enough. Unfortunately, he had been too young at the time and hadn't gotten a good look at the man's face. Silas's expression changed, remembering the accusation he had thrown at Asher during their argument. If you had watched your family die in front of you, you would understand how I feel right now. A lump formed in his throat. He tried several times but couldn't bring himself to say thank you. He reached into his coat, took out a vial of medicine, and tossed it to Asher, saying it was for his injuries. Asher was surprised, then laughed out loud. Thanks. Silas's cheeks flushed slightly. He said there was no need for thanks. Asher said he was a good guy. He uncorked the vial and sniffed it, surprised. He asked if it was a 100-herb elixir. He had heard that, on the open market, a single pill was worth a fortune. Silas cut him off coldly, telling him not to hoard it to sell later. Caught, Asher cleared his throat and said seriously that he wasn't going to sell it. It was just that the stuff was so valuable, he was surprised Silas was willing to give it to him. He could tell that Silas held a grudge. Silas turned his face away, his expression impassive as he retorted that he didn't want to be the one getting tortured in Asher's nightmares. Asher was taken aback for a moment, then burst out laughing. He assured him that he didn't hold grudges overnight. He usually got his revenge on the spot. He said that when Silas had hit him, he had broken his cane, so they were even. Later, when he came back after capturing the necromancer and found that Silas had fainted from anger, he had actually felt pretty bad about it. Silas didn't bother to correct him that he had fainted because of his heart condition. He took the golden bell and walked into the forest. The sounds of screaming echoed through the hills for half the night. Asher let him be. After treating his wounds, he used a stick to draw in the dirt. At dawn, Silas emerged from the trees, his hands stained with blood. When he handed the golden bell back to Asher, he noticed what Asher had been drawing on the ground. He asked what it was. Asher, with a blade of grass in his mouth, saw him and said excitedly that he was just in time. He said that since Silas's heart condition was so severe, and it was hard for him to get around, he would make him a wheelchair when he got back to Blackwood to make things easier for him. Silas was touched. He started to speak, but Asher cut him off bluntly. He told him not to look at him like that, he wasn't doing it for free. He wanted some more of that 100-herb elixir, it worked really well. Look, his shoulder didn't even hurt anymore. He squatted there, stretching his arm out in a wide circle, then looked up at Silas, a smile on his face, his eyes shining. In the morning light, his young face was incredibly bright and pure. Silas found himself smiling back. He agreed. Asher told him it was time to go back. But he didn't get up, just pointed to his own shoulders. Now that he was healed, he could get on. The smile in his eyes had a strange warmth. He said he would carry him home. How many years had it been since then? Silas couldn't remember. The wooden wheels of the wheelchair rolled over the shifting sands before the tower. The tower door creaked open. The moment it opened, 1,000 fragmented voices rushed into Silas's ears. Whispers like a rising tide, chasing him, driving him, until they completely submerged him. Senior Silas. Silas. Frosty. Asher stood under a grove of peach trees in the Clearwater Annex courtyard, pushing the new wheelchair he had made. He waved to Silas, who was standing with his cane on the training grounds, calling out Frosty. The word sent a shiver of fear through the Clearwater disciples on the field, making them wish they could go deaf. Brother Dust. This time it was a girl's voice, as gentle as a peach blossom petal falling in the wind. Silas, you're here. Silas, you're so slow. The Clearwater disciple pushing him into the tower side in relief as his feet touched the solid floor inside. But when he glanced down, he saw that Silas's face was pale and bluish, his knuckles white as he gripped the armrests of his wheelchair, his entire body trembling. He called out his name in alarm.